thank you all again for coming, and thank you to our guests. Really appreciate it. We've obviously had a week to digest the election results, and so I'm sure folks have thoughts. But I'd like to start with our journalists and get their assessment of what happened and why, and if there were any particular surprises that you saw. And Carl, why don't we start with you?
Good morning, everybody. Just as standing over at the side, I was thinking, what could I tell a group like this that you haven't already heard in the week's worth of Monday and Tuesday morning quarterbacking? And I guess having been out in a lot of these battleground states, particularly for the Senate contests, one of the things that I think is really surprising is how on both sides, from a political perspective, not a policy, not an electorate perspective, but how the political apparatus was so off base in both parties. Republicans did not expect to win as big as they did. In some of the battles for the Senate where they won by 15 points, the day of the election and the days leading up to the election, they were talking about what were going to be very tough, very close nail-biters. And the Democrats, of course, thought that there was always a possibility, even though the deck was sort of stacked against them and the landscape was so tilted right, that they could perhaps protect or at least keep it close. And neither side was right. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party misunderestimated. And that is sort of the exclamation point and underscore comes from independents and non-registered voters are growing, speak about solutions more aggressively than the members of the two parties, and are directly hemorrhaging from those two parties and alienated and disaffected far more than the parties actually understand. And that they're fed up. And even the politicians and the consultants and the candidates and the volunteers who were pounding the pavement talking to all these voters didn't see it right in front of them. And we didn't really see it here in Washington. And because of so much of the coverage of the news is driven by polls and driven by attack ads and driven by short themes and internet memes, there wasn't a heck of a lot to discuss other than the game. And so the discussion of whether there was an election and a campaign about nothing really wasn't even a discussion. It was just another thought that passed through the discourse between attack ads.
So Nia, have we entered into an era of change elections? Is it always going to be change elections? Throw the bums out.
You know, I mean, in some ways, they didn't throw the bums out, right? I mean, if you look at somebody in Colorado, a lot of the people who ended up winning they were Republicans, they came from the House, and they ended up winning these seats. So I think incumbents actually did pretty well. It was just the Democratic incumbents that didn't do well. But I think when you're looking forward to 2016, that is something to think about. What will be on voters' minds come 2016? What does that mean for Hillary Clinton? Can she sort of embody change come 2016? What kind of faith and credibility will voters have in the political apparatus, the press being part of that? In some ways, you feel like they want to throw the bums out, and the bums are us, are the press and the pollsters who want to try to handicap elections before the voters actually talk. And I think there is the broader theme of whether or not midterm elections are always going to be different than presidential elections. If you look at 2010, if you look at 2014, if you look at 2006, the electorate, it wasn't really that different, but the outcome's very, very different. In a lot of ways, it just came down to Republicans doing better. The brand for Republicans was better in 2014, better in 2010, and in 2006, it was better for Democrats. But I do think one of the things we've talked about it just in terms of change is sort of the demographic change. And I think we've often framed it here in Washington as demographics are destiny, and those demographics automatically benefit Democrats. And I just think we sort of oversold that idea in a lot of ways. And in some ways, I think Democrats themselves have believed it too much and to their own detriment, certainly in 2014.
So you talk about Democrats, and I want to ask about the message. And John Allen, I'll address this to you. Do you think Democrats got the message, and do you think Republicans got the wrong message?
I don't think the Democrats got the message. All we're hearing from Democrats right now and from the president is, let's double down on what we were doing before. We're going to jam as much through as we can in the last 2 years. I don't hear anything that suggests we heard the message. No, there was a shellacking, let's recalibrate. It's more like, let's blame the cabinet for not doing their job. Let's blame Valerie Jarrett for not doing her job. Let's blame whoever we can, but not look in the mirror when we're shaving in the morning, for those of us that shave in the morning, or for folks who shave in the morning. And
Oscar
say,
didn't shave this morning.
and say, what is it that we did wrong? I want to just, if I could jump on something that these guys were saying. I think we exploded a few myths in this election cycle. One is the myth that you have to run on something to win. In 2010, the Republicans ran on a pledge to America. In 2006, Democrats ran on 6 for 06. In 94, Republicans were the contract with America. And I think many other elections with forgotten slogans we've forgotten because they didn't win. But this time, the Republicans really just ran on, we're not the other guy. We can stop President Obama and his overreach or Democratic overreach. So I think that was an interesting myth that was exploded. There was a myth exploded about black turnout. If you look at from state to state, you saw high numbers of black turnout in swing states, much increased. Somebody was telling me this morning there was only one state where it was down among the contested states. So what we saw was the Democrats, in fact, turned out the African-American base and still got hammered, which leads to the third myth that is exploded here, which is that there aren't persuadable voters anymore. It's just a base versus a base. I think what we saw this year is that you do, in fact, have persuadable voters, and they all pretty much went in one direction.
I'm going to get to Jessica in just a second, but for the Republican on the panel, I wanted to see if you'd address that, David. What do you think about the myth v. fact here?
No, I mean, I think, look, as a Republican, I think we'd be pretty foolish to think that this was some overwhelming stamp of approval for congressional Republican leadership. It clearly was not. I mean, while exit polls showed that only 41% of voters approve of the president, only 38% approve of Republican leadership. John's point about running on nothing, I think, is an important one moving forward because it has left a vast policy vacuum that Republican congressional leadership is going to have to fill somehow. When you run on nothing, is it now suddenly every Republican Congress person for him or herself?
So in terms of the results, a lot of people have said, and a lot of pundits have prognosticated that the Republican victories are probably going to help propel Hillary Clinton or whomever the Democratic nominee for president is in 2016. Jessica, what do you think of that theory?
I think that, it's a very different electorate that we're going to be looking at in 2016. Certainly, Hillary Clinton will certainly have now more that she can run against if there is a Republican-controlled Congress. And there's, I'm sure, certain things that they will do that she will point to. But I think that ultimately both parties, they've got to figure out, Democrats have got to figure out how to win in a midterm year when there is decreased turnout, when there is a more excited Republican base. But also Republicans have got to figure out in 2016 they can't rest on their laurels. They have to know that the turnout is going to be more similar to 2012. It's going to be more diverse. And, I mean, that's why, a lot of Republicans I was talking to privately even the month leading up to it thinking, like, we can't, they were afraid that people would sort of get this false sense of hope. Like, we had these huge wins in 2014, now leading into 2016, but that you're going to have Hispanic voters, they're concerned about immigration reform, you're going to have more women voters turning out and things too, and Republicans can't just play to the base. They largely could this election, and I think you saw, Republicans also, they got out strong candidates finally. They didn't get through these Todd Aikens. They played in primaries. I think I think it's going to be interesting to see if you see groups do that more so in the Republican presidential primary so that they get a more electable candidate out there. But, I mean, Hillary, I think, too, would be wise to sort of take some of these lessons going forward. The fact that, she does, I think, have to have this message separate from the White House. She's got to find a way to separate herself.
Oscar, after the elections, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who, as everyone knows, is the chairwoman of the Democratic National Committee, suggested that there were two electorates, a presidential electorate and a midterm electorate, and Democrats could not get their arms around the midterm electorate, and they needed to change that dynamic if they wanted to start changing the results in these midterms. What do you make of that, and do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. If you look at nationally, the African-American and Hispanic vote together went from 23 to 20%. Single women from 23 to 21%. Millennials, which are the most fickle of all these voting groups in terms of turnout and in terms of who they vote for, from 19 to 12%. So there is a different electorate. And this, when I think of 2014, I think of the three M's. I think of the map, which is a very unique map, which gives you a unique result. I think, of motivation in terms of voter turnout. It was, I think, under 37%, which is the lowest you've had since 1940. And that will give you a different result. And then and the money. I mean, I think Democrats did a pretty good job in terms of money raised by the candidates, by the campaign committees, some of the hard money from outside groups, but some in terms of the post-Citizens United dark money. And Kay Hagan's the best example. I mean, they really spent months increasing her negatives when she didn't have the money to respond. So I think those are kind of the takeaways. And I think what Debbie Wasserman Schultz is absolutely right, that you do have different electorates, but you can't just say, okay, we're going to win every 4 years. When our voters come out, you need to find a way to make distinctions so your voters, your base, have reason to come out during the midterms.
I mean, if Democrats want to do better in the midterms, they have to stop winning the White House.
You'll make that trade.
Call Hillary and let her know, your theory.
But he makes a good point that, Democrats are saying, oh, we can never win a midterm because our voters don't come in. It's just not true. Like history, Democrats have won midterms before, and usually they win when there's a Republican in the White House. I think Democrats did turn out their voters, as you said. There was all this talk about, are African Americans going to stay home because Grimes says she didn't vote for Obama, but in that state, a Democrat was never, ever, 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 ever going to win, partly because white voters aren't voting Democratic anymore in these southern states. How do you win a state like Kentucky with winning, 35% of the white vote? In Georgia, I think none got like 27% of the white vote. Impossible to win that state with those numbers. So that, I think, the map was much harder than Democrats thought it was. And even when they got their voters out, I mean, even Mary Landrieu got a lot of voters out in Louisiana, black voters, but it just wasn't enough because the map and the math and the decline of support for Democrats among white voters is just, a real headwind that Democrats were facing.
We're only talking about 8 years ago that Democrats won a midterm election in a huge blue sweep across the country.
Yeah.
It's not like the fundamentals of midterm elections versus presidential elections have changed so much. The electorates are very different, but that doesn't mean that you can't win. One side can't win the presidential, or both sides can't win the presidential, or both sides can't win the midterm. I think that I've looked back at all the votes for U.S. House elections over the last several cycles, like just all the Republican votes versus all the Democratic votes across the country. And only once in that time did a party, and this was 2012, did a party lose that calculation. So the Democrats won more House votes in 2012 than the Republicans did, and the Republicans, of course, had the majority in the House. But most of the time, the outcome reflects what most voters want in the House. Maybe the share of it or the representation within the House is a little different, but it usually just follows that the guys who run the better campaigns win.
But a lot of this conversation is focusing on what most voters would tell you is part of the problem. There's such an emphasis on tactics and strategy that ideas are completely subordinated. And the mastery of the tactics and strategy, whether it's the Democrats' advantage digitally and in social media, or the Republicans' advantage with certain types of fundraising and door knocking in the last 72 hours over the past few years, and now marrying it, which is with their new sort of beta-tested big data program in these midterms. We've gotten to a point in the country where if you start any given race, whether it's for dog catcher or president, you're pretty much around 46.5% to 46.5% at the get-go. And so the battle has become for that gap remainder. And we can tell you what states it's going to be fought out in 2016. We can tell you what counties will be most important. We can tell you right now who the activists who are right now the most influential and will probably be engaged in that race. So the tactics and strategy have gotten so intensely mastered by both sides that it's very easy to ignore issues and give voters what's necessary for a response. And what ends up happening is the bases, the most distilled ideologues in each party, become the motivation. They're the ones who are tapped first, and it grows from there. And we're now 15, 20 minutes into this, and we haven't talked about a single piece of issue, politics, that just took place. Nor
I was
what's
getting to
possible.
that.
Oh, no, I know. But as we talk about, we haven't talked about how Kay Hagan blew it on X, or Tom Tillis just lapped her with a particular policy speech or an idea that was just so commanding of North Carolinians that they were like, oh, well, that's right, absolutely. none of this, it's going to be a late night in North Carolina, and we could be looking at a recount, airdrop the lawyers there.
Well, I'd like to say too, and I want to address this to David. I mean, this is beyond politics. I mean, anymore, analytics even drive public policy.
Well, look, I mean, I think this also goes to the question of persuadable voters, right? And the fact, and another myth that was busted here and has been over the last decade or so is that all politics is local. This was not a local election. This was a national election. It was cultural. We're seeing a continuation of parliamentary-like voting patterns here, and the number of ticket splitters has diminished to close to zero.
I think also we saw in some of these states just that candidates matter, candidate quality matters, that how they appeal to the states matter. I mean, I think Colorado and Iowa were perfect examples where you had Joni Ernst. I think she came across as a more likable candidate. Bruce Braley had his missteps, certainly. I mean, Democrats tried to make this about policy, about issues, but I think that Ernst, in her TV ads, in the way she appealed to independent voters, to women, I think she came across as sort of the more likable candidate that voters could relate to. I think the same thing with Cory Gardner, his TV ads the same way, and also that Democrats kept trying to hammer him. They thought that personhood, that social issues were sort of going to be his undoing, and it ended up really not being so. So I think that it showed too that candidate quality still matters. I think that's why you saw even as Republicans picked up it's about 15 seats right now, pending some recounts and final counts, but that really bad candidates in Florida and Nebraska ended up losing even amid sort of a wave election too.
So I think we've done the postmortem quite effectively, and I think it's time to look a little bit ahead. Obviously, right after the elections, Obama put down his marker, Republicans put down their marker. Wanted to get your sense of what's going to happen in the next 4 weeks, 4 or 5 weeks. Maybe we'll be here till Christmas, who knows. Can any public policy actually get done? What do you think is going to get done? And how, even maybe more importantly, what is the relationship going to be like between the Democrats, the Republicans, and President Obama in the next 4 or 5 weeks?
Well,
No, I suggested terrible, but you go ahead.
I say the first thing that will get done is probably, I think next week might be, when the president gets back from Australia, might be Immigration Week, is they might see an executive action on an expanded DACA. So I think you might see that soon, and then that might, let dominoes kind of go from there, fall from there. In terms of what might happen on the Hill and lame duck, defense authorization might happen in the first week in December. Some form of tax extenders. There's a little bit of controversy in terms of what that actually looks like. Maybe a lot of controversy. You have some sort of mixture of CR and omnibus. Certain things might be extended long term. Certain things are going to be short term. So there is going to be action. Hopefully it won't be till Christmas, but there will be some action over the next few weeks here.
So in essence, we're not going to get a ton done. We're going to put the Band-Aids on what we have to put the Band-Aids on, and then obviously move into the next Congress.
I think one thing you're not going to see get through is the Attorney General with Loretta Lynch. I think the Republicans are making it clear they want this in the new Congress. I think the Democrats have sort of seeded this behind the scenes, and would the president love to get her through in the lame duck? Yes, but I just think politically that's not going to happen. They don't want to sort of use all of their chips there. I mean, I think for these first couple of weeks, it's sort of everyone sort of, I could see them being on their best behavior almost. Oh yes, we want to work with you. We want to work with you on this and stuff too. But I think that sort of facade will fade very quickly once we get into the beginning of the next Congress.
I think the Democrats want Lynch to also be, there's some mixture of thought on that, but to do the kind of murder boards that you would want to do before she faces the Senate Judiciary Committee, you probably don't want that happening in the next couple of weeks. This is somebody who
and
has
a charm
been,
offensive, and to do the laps around the Hill and go.
it's unrealistic to think that would happen well in a December session.
And the charm offensive is important for her tenure.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
She's the whole thing. Right. Exactly. She's got to be able to go in front of these people again and again and again. And as we've seen, also on the House side, she'll probably be before the Oversight and Judiciary. The Oversight and Government Reform Committee a few times, and Judiciary. I think if the president comes back next week and does the executive order on immigration, the read from that is that he wants to blow up the legislative process for November and December. So if he wants to not do that, he would wait till they leave town and then do it. There will be, even if we're here till Christmas, there's a week in there to get that done after the omnibus CR is done, possibly tax extenders, at least some of the tax extenders. And then I think what we should watch for, not only in this lame duck, but also next year, everything's going to be funneled through the budget process. So for this year, that means a lot of stuff on the omnibus or CR potentially going in and out, and I think a lot of people in this room probably care about those things. But next year, for Republicans to send things to the president, they're going to have to agree on a budget in the House and Senate, and then they're going to have to send reconciliation bills, because they're not going to be able to get 60 votes for most of the things that they want to do that challenge the president to set up a potential veto fight, or have him sign things, or pocket veto them, or pocket let them go into law. So I think that's the thing, that the process that we'll watch. And they have the House Republicans have interest, Senate Republicans, the president, the Republican presidential nominee, Hillary Clinton, and all of them will at some places intersect, and then all of them will diverge at other places. But the budget, I think, is the place to watch.
We know from what both sides have said, what the president said in his post-election news conference and what Mitch Mcconnell said in the news conference that took place only an hour beforehand, when asked about the immigration executive order. The most memorable thing that McConnell said the day after the election was that was like waving a red flag in front of a bull. If that happens, McConnell has then a whole series of actions and tough counter moves that he can do. It'll be interesting to see if they're going to throw some money toward Ebola, and whether or not they're actually going to make the war against ISIL something that Congress gets involved in or not. That could happen in the lame duck, although it's hard to figure out how. It's worth saying, too, for those of you who think that the legislature isn't working, there actually are some appropriators who've been thinking about trying to put together an omnibus for a long time now. The likelihood of that in the current circumstances, when everybody's waiting for a fight, not a kumbaya, are pretty small. But there actually are documents there that would serve as the backbone of exactly what Jonathan's talking about. So it could happen, but it's in everybody's interest to sort of do what little they can around the periphery, do a CR and get out of town, even though the omnibus, there are some who think that would be a great thing to do because it would give them a budget process to move forward with. But
That's why we need
I
to bring
imagine
back-
they go hybrid.
Yeah.
They'll do an omnibus
They'll
with
do a
what's
little both.
non-controversial and a CR to
Right.
September 30th,
Everything
and
else.
next year for Labor H or whatever else is the thing that attracts all the bad magnets.
And that, if they can come up with something like that, that will be bigger movement than we've seen in a long time under pretty strange circumstances. So that'll be cause for hope.
This all just screams for bringing back earmarks.
Right. Make it possible
I should also
for
say
people
that,
to agree on something.
Beyond the lame duck, heading into the first 6 months of next year, you're going to inevitably see a flurry of activity because of the number of things that have expired or will soon expire. So, we have a highway bill, we have Ex-Im Bank, we have the dock fix.
Debt ceiling.
Debt ceiling. I agree with John that the reconciliation process is going to be the most fun one to watch.
So what
Yeah.
about some
If
of
they
the,
can get a budget, if the House Republicans and Senate Republicans can get budgets in their chambers and agree to them, which is a big challenge.
You also have other issues next year. Both the administration and Congress want to pass trade promotion authority. They want to pass Trans-Pacific Partnership, patent reform. So there are a couple of issues that maybe a Democratic Senate got in the way of actually accomplishing this last couple of years. So I think you might see movement in that.
I think trade promotion authority is one that can get done.
so what about the
Democrats
issues
will
of
oppose that.
what about the big issues? What about healthcare reform? What about immigration? What about Keystone? Where do you see, is there any possibility for compromise in any of those big controversial?
The way they talk about it, it doesn't seem to be like there's any agreement, right? I mean, you have the Republicans, at least rhetorically, say they want to, strip it out root and branch. Maybe they'll settle for doing something around the medical device taxes. Keystone Pipeline, Democrats and Republicans seem to be on opposite sides of that. So, if you look at, I guess Boehner and McConnell wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and if you look at the list of things they want to do, it doesn't at all match with what Obama wants to do and what the Democrats want to do. Maybe the Hiring Heroes Act, people can sort of rally around something like that. And they don't even mention immigration reform on that list either. So, in terms of the big things, in terms of Social Security, putting that on a path to stability, health care. Obama's pretty happy right now with the Affordable Care Act. He doesn't want to see that repealed. They do. So in terms of common ground, it looks like it'll be small bore issues.
9 months. 9 months of work, and then 16 consumes all.
You think
Nothing
it's gonna be 9
nothing
months?
happens past June or
Don't
July
know
of
if it's
next
gonna
year.
be
Did
other
you
than
say months or days?
Yeah,
Right.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Hours.
the possibility of anything getting finished, the window closes in 9 months.
With the exception of the Oversight and Investigations Committees, right?
They will go until they go. Yeah.
I think the key for on immigration at this point for the Republicans is when Obama does the executive order, figuring out how to make their antipathy for that about the process, about the presidential use of executive power. And I think they're starting to do that now, but I would not bank on them going an entire cycle without sounding insensitive to Latinos over that period of time. Like, I wouldn't bet a ton of money on that, but I think they're setting up right now to make it about that process, and I think that's probably their best bet, given that they're unable to come together on an immigration bill to get through the House, at least right now.
Keystone's a very interesting one for me. I think that there are enough votes there now in the Senate. We'll see if that is something they push through. I think it sort of forces the president's hand if it does come to his desk, and I think that's a really interesting one to watch to sort of see if the White House could see something. That's something that I could see them maybe backing off a little bit, but we'll see.
I want to ask about the president's relevancy. I mean, clearly in the last 2 years of any two-term president, your relevancy diminishes, and as we've seen, the presidential takes over even earlier than it ever did. So when does Obama become truly irrelevant?
I stood out in polling places. I was just thinking as you were asking the question.
Sorry,
Iowa,
Oscar.
Kansas, Kentucky. Where else did we go? Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, New Hampshire, and a couple of other of the battleground states, and did the man on the street thing countless afternoons. And it's apathy. The attack ads so toxified the minds of both sides that they didn't believe anybody, didn't believe the president, didn't believe Republicans, didn't believe the notion of change, thought that they had to vote to send a message of anger and frustration, and weren't exactly hopeful that it would get received. So he wasn't the drag, notwithstanding the nationalized aspect of the election and his unpopularity, in the end, because people were so buffeted with negative ads that they ultimately reverted to type. And more Republicans turned out than Democrats, and there was a little bit of success with closing the gender gap in a couple of places for Republicans. The Republicans have a huge gender gap with men, and again, with a nation as evenly divided as we have, drop a ton of money in, stir and cook, and you'll have angry, distilled electorates, and it's going to be close every time. This one wasn't because of what we already knew. It was the midterm and the second term of a presidency. It's an economy that is coming back, but statistically, but people don't feel it out in the world. And out in the world, things are messed up, and people are uneasy. It's pretty simple.
So what about 2016? There's obviously a lot of speculation that, the ink wasn't even dry on the elections, and as we knew, everybody's already talking about 2 years from now. So who do you guys think gets in? Who doesn't get in? And also I want to ask about McConnell trying to manage a caucus of contenders.
I think everybody's in already. It's about who gets out. I mean, Rand Paul is clearly already running for president. Even somebody like Ben Carson seems already to be running for president. Ted Cruz, until they say they're not running, I think we cover them and look at them as if they are running. I think Ted Cruz is going to be fascinating to watch, even though Rand Paul has become the most interesting man in politics. In some ways, that's not very hard to do. But that's sort of his reputation now. But I think Ted Cruz, in terms of knowing what his audience is, the sort of evangelical audience, he's fantastic at that. He has sort of a preacherly presence on stage. He's a fantastic debater. He's got a great political mind, and I think he's going to be just fascinating to watch. And if I was Rand Paul, I'd be a little nervous.
I think Rand Paul, he did a very good job this cycle of being strategic in where he helped, and also almost sort of bridging this divide. I mean, who would have thought that we would have seen Rand Paul cutting ads for the Chamber of Commerce? And he came out there, he was a valuable surrogate in places. I think he can still appeal to that Tea Party base, maybe not as much as a Ted Cruz can, but he also doesn't turn off other voters. He's clearly trying to sort of bridge that divide between the more Tea Party conservative base and the establishment. And I mean, McConnell, he is going to have several people in his caucus running, but he's also sort of already sort of staked his claim there with Rand Paul. I mean, saying in an interview last week, if he runs, I'll be there for him, or whatever he decides to do, I'll be there for him. I mean, Rand Paul was backing him in his state and his primary. I think he, owes a lot to him for that. But it's just gonna be a cluster of people that get in. Like Nia said, I mean, like Ben Carson. I mean, let's not forget the governors too. I mean, Chris Christie had a very good night on. I mean, we're all talking about the Senate here and everything too. But I mean, the fact that he did go to places where you wouldn't have expected him to go, and it paid off, like places like Maryland. And he helped some of these people win that maybe in a different environment maybe would have been overlooked, because you look back who would have won in Maryland, but he went there, he helped Larry Hogan. They increased their numbers, because I remember even a year ago we were talking about there's no way the Democrats don't pick up governors. They had a better map and things. But I mean, his maybe quasi feud with Scott Walker will be interesting. I mean, Walker, he can point to the fact that he has now won 3 elections in a very blue state under very difficult circumstances. I think that's, and what does Jeb do? I mean, he was obviously out there helping and things too. Does Romney run? I mean, I think that there's certainly more questions than we have answers for right now, and we have months to decide this. But it's going to be a very interesting field.
Mr. Hillary.
That's right. Literally wrote the book.
Well, so I have a couple of sort
John
of.
Allen wrote a Hillary Clinton book, if you all.
Please buy it. Please buy it. Please buy 10 of them. I'll sign them. Whatever. Makes a nice Christmas gift.
Yeah.
Especially for people who don't like her, it's a nice gag gift. So there are a couple of things that I think about the emerging field. Number one of the things I think is fascinating to watch in the next week or so is the rollout of George W. Bush's book about his dad. Because I think the rehabilitation and reemergence of George W. Bush is an important factor for Jeb Bush. I think, we see head-to-head matchups, Hillary Clinton versus Jeb Bush, Hillary Clinton versus Rand Paul. In all of them, Jeb Bush runs toward the tail end. And the explanation for that is clearly that George W. Bush remains unpopular. The name remains unpopular. So the extent that he's burnishing that brand a little bit or trying to do that right now, we heard him go after President Obama a couple weeks ago on Iraq. I think that's an interesting dynamic to watch. I think it matters a lot for Jeb Bush's candidacy. If I were Dara Bush, I'd be really upset because she wrote a book about George H.W. Bush. And then her brother comes along and is like, hey, you know what? I'm going to get a big deal. I'm going to do this. As far as Hillary Clinton goes, I think, first of all, she should not be under any illusion that it is easy to win a third term from the same party. I mean, for anybody in the Democratic Party who thinks that they're going to waltz into the White House because they have, for right now, what looks like the varsity candidate, and on the Republican side, you've got JV's the wrong term. I think what you've got is 8 vice presidential contenders right now, and nobody's yet kind of crossed that line, right? There's 8 people that you would love to put on a ticket to appeal to some set in the base. So I think for her, she's got to be totally worried about just the general dynamics of trying to win a third term. She's got to be worried about the fact that the more she's out there talking about politics, the less popular she is. Her numbers come down. That said, if I were her, I think I might be drooling over the prospect of having a first-term senator as my opposition, because it's such an easy way to distance herself from President Obama and hit a Republican opponent at the same time. She just says, we tried a first-term senator. How did that work? And she doesn't say it quite that directly. But her surrogates do. I mean, I can imagine James Carville saying that with some colorful Louisiana-ism or some reference to male anatomy. But I think that message is probably a strong one for Democrats in a way that is both distancing and punishing to the Republicans.
Did she run in the center?
Yes. For the most part, I mean, look, the issue sets will be different. She's been pretty liberal on social issues. I think she'll continue to be that way because the American public is that way, and I think she will fight a Republican. If it's a Christie or a Bush, she'll fight for that center on economics, particularly with ties to the business community, on being a hawk. For a Democrat, she's definitely a hawk. For a Republican, she might be a hawk. So I think she'll continue to be like that. I actually don't think you're going to see a huge change from the way she ran in 2008 the first time. I think what's changed is the atmospherics. And I think she'll appeal to women more directly than she has before, but I think we'll learn from this midterm election that Democrats can overplay that war on women meme. I think you saw the gender gap among women close in most places, and I think there may have been sort of too much of an appeal just on that. Udall did that, and I think some of the other Democratic candidates were doing that. So I think with some slight changes and some definitely better technology, she got lapped in 2008 by Obama. I think you're actually going to see a campaign that's fairly consistent with what she did in 2008.
Yeah,
And
and she didn't. Yeah, go ahead.
The nature of her her breadth of experience and history is such that if she settles in what could be defined as a centrist mode, she'll immediately get slammed for not being liberal enough or having been too conservative. If she were to lead right on a particular issue, she'll immediately get questioned about why aren't you being a centrist. She has a history, she has a breadth of experience that allows her to be criticized for so much because she's been and said and done so much, often on issue sets where policy approaches have changed. So one of the things that I wonder is, what is the identity? What are the identity politics for a viable Democratic alternative to Hillary Clinton? We know Martin O'Malley wasn't in Annapolis on election night, or hadn't been there very much in the preceding couple of weeks. I saw him a lot out in Iowa and New Hampshire on the 2014 campaign trail. So is it a Cuomo? Is it Elizabeth Warren who's not running? Is it a Gillibrand? Is there a male who can run against Hillary credibly? And on the Republican side, the same thing is true. I mean, one of the things that will be very interesting to watch as this thing gets started into next year, the Republicans are going to try to control the debate process. Now, we've talked about 8 or 10 Republican candidates. I can get you to 16 without even trying. And they're not all going to fit on a debate stage. And so it'll be interesting to see if you were a Republican strategist, and I know there are more than a few in the room, you'd want to make sure that that debate stage of 6 or 7 potential contenders would represent the country, not necessarily the stereotype of the Republican Party. So you want to have some minority candidates. It'd be nice to have a woman up there in the Republican Party running for president. Those are the types of things that we're not hearing a lot about in the current field. There's a lot of conservative Republicans, and many of whom are sort of driven by the winds of the 2010 Tea Party. And it's absolutely wide open. And in Iowa, Democrats who support Hillary Clinton are quick to say they also support their caucus, which needs to be competitive. The very first contest, whether you consider a caucus an official one or not, a relevant one or not, even Democrats who like her want her to have at least a credible sparring partner. And again, the nature of the machinery of our politics is such, they'll start at 46.5%, drop in $4 billion aside, and sooner or later we'll have an outcome, and we can already tell you what counties they'll be decided in. Because it's going to end up being about that close, almost no matter who gets nominated in either party under our current situation. Because so much is predictable, so much is manageable in the political science of the campaign and in getting people to the voting booth.
By the way, on Clinton, we saw how smooth she was going left a couple weeks ago when she said that companies don't create jobs. And then it was companies don't create, tax breaks for companies don't create jobs. And then it was tax breaks for companies that ship jobs overseas or keep profits overseas don't create jobs. And I mean, it's hard for her to go left on some of these issues because it's not where she's been. You know, I mean, and I don't think it doesn't resonate well. It's not natural for her, and I doubt that she's going to spend a whole lot of time trying to do that.
But it is also true that Hillary Clinton, on a lot of issues when she ran, was further to the left of Obama. She wasn't in the same place as Obama on foreign policy. She's more hawkish there, but all of a sudden Obama is looking also pretty hawkish with drones and with sending troops back into Iraq. I think we sort of underestimate how well Hillary Clinton actually did in 2008. She actually got more votes than Obama did. She lost because of sort of the structure of the system and the sort of delegates. I think she's a strong candidate. I think we also sort of underestimate the Democratic bench. There is a Democratic bench. It just so happens that Hillary Clinton is taking up all of the room now. And if she wasn't there, then somebody, like you said, somebody like Gillibrand, could be just as viable a candidate as like a Marco Rubio or anybody like that. I think it will be interesting to see how she plays the gender card. I think we already are sort of seeing her talk about gender in a way that she hadn't before. And also she's making this argument that women do it better, right? She talks about how the women on the Hill are about compromise and bipartisanship and working across the aisle. And a lot of focus groups seem to suggest that voters actually think that women can. I mean, it's sort of a sexist stereotype to think that women are better at the sort of kumbaya politics. But I do think that's something that Clinton will both implicitly and explicitly talk about. And she also is probably going to run at a time when there's a sort of casual feminism going on, where Beyonce can dance at the VMAs in front of a big banner that says feminist and nobody bats an eye. So that's also, I think, an interesting cultural dynamic in which she'll run in.
If you remember back to the spring of '07, one of the things that made Senator Obama a real candidate was that he was able to raise a lot of small dollars. So that he was able to hire staff, around the country. The press covered it in a way where it made it a real race. So the question for my outgoing governor in Maryland, Jim Webb, and anybody else who wants to run is, are they going to be able to raise those small dollars? Because they're not going to be able to get the big dollars. Hillary has that locked up. Are they going to be able to raise the small dollars to run a real campaign? If we're in the spring and the first quarter numbers come out and Hillary has a 20-1 fundraising advantage, all of a sudden, it doesn't look like a real race. And I agree that Hillary doesn't wear well. So the less of a race she has and the more she can kind of jump in and out of things, I think the better for her.
Also, the big money matters more now. I mean, in 2008, Hillary Clinton could call Haim Saban and he could give her $2,300. Now she can call him and he can give her $2 or $3 or $4 or $5 million for a super PAC. And in fact, he said he will spend whatever it takes to elect her president. So if you watch the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, you bought those figures for your kids, you're going to be funding the Democratic presidential campaign in 2016. But if you look through the constellation of Democratic donors, big Democratic donors, they're all ready to line up for her. I mean, you can find a quote from somebody, Guy Saperstein out in San Francisco. You can call up and maybe he'll tell you that somebody other than Hillary Clinton will get his money. But there's one or two people that you can get quoted that way. Meanwhile, they've had this apparatus with Ready for Hillary at the small level and Priorities and American Bridge. I mean, they've been running a campaign for the last 2 years, a Sub Rosa campaign, kind of Sub Rosa, but it's a pretty big juggernaut.
There was a point at the Harkins steak fry where the Clintons both came to celebrate Harkins' retirement, and the big deal was there, several thousand people. And the nascent Hillary campaign was lined up in cars and pickup trucks on a dirt road in a cornfield in Iowa. You had the Ready for Hillary, the list that John just rattled off, representatives, people, staffers, volunteers for all of those various different organizations were all basically waiting in their car for the event to go, and off they all went. And it was like, pretty soon they're going to be in black Suburbans and they're going to be as part of a motorcade. But that's it. They're all there, and all those organizations that have the capacity to slip into all the various different departments of a national presidential campaign are already up and running at full bore.
And they were in Idaho and Montana this week with the Ready for Hillary bus. I mean, it's not just the swing states. Right. They're looking at what Obama did in caucus states last time and making sure that there's nobody that can do the same kind of thing to them.
Way ahead of Republicans. Even the Rand Pauls and the Ted Cruzes who've made multiple trips to Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina have nothing like what's waiting for Hillary.
I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask the panelists some questions. So if there's anyone that has a question, just raise your hand and bring the mic.
Should do like a football toss.
Oh yeah, for the boys.
Now, Maryland, she's from Maryland. Maryland's all about football, according to Wedding Crashers.
Hi, Crystal Frierson, JSA alum. I'm curious to hear your impressions regarding whether there's sort of a growing constituency around Veterans Affairs and whether that weighs in favor of the Democrats or Republicans, and also how it's maybe different from traditional military constituencies, if at all.
I think that we keep creating veterans at a pretty rapid pace over the last decade, and we're obviously not doing what we need to do to take care of them in terms of our budget, and not only the budget but the management. We've seen the VA scandal. I think part and parcel of our inability to sort of prepare for the effects of the wars that we've had. And I do think you're seeing a growing veterans constituency, but I don't think that it's necessarily, I haven't detected necessarily that it's partisan one way or the other. I think veterans, like any other group, are not monolithic. And I think, but what you are starting to see more of is recent veterans running for Congress and running for office and using that as a means to get there, talking about their military background. So whether you're talking about Tulsi Gabbard or the new Hawaii Democrat that's joining her, Mark Takei, I think is his name. Joni Ernst. Joni Ernst had the Tom Cotton. Yeah. Joni Ernst had the greatest line of any candidate, which was, "I'm a mother and a soldier." And it was like such a gripping, like powerful idea. I think it was originally Mother Soldier Conservative, and it may have then been like Mother Soldier Independent Leader. But like those two lines, like Mother Soldier, I was like, you're going to protect me and you're going to protect me. Like this, like, I mean, and the other guy, Bruce Bailey, was like talking to trial lawyers in Texas or something. I mean, it was like, I've never seen a worse match of candidates, like where one was so good and one was so bad. But I think that that's I think that that's a discussion that we're going to have to continue to have, because we are producing not only so many veterans, but so many disabled veterans. Because the people who would have died in previous wars are coming back with grievous injuries that are going to have to be taken care of for a long time. And I think, you know, it is Veterans Day, and it's a time to think about how do we treat our veterans. And I think, you know, ideally that's a nonpartisan thing. And I actually think our Veterans Affairs committees in the House and Senate tend to work in pretty nonpartisan ways, and the politics often gets in the way of that. What are you spending on that versus that? So I think the party that's able to come up with the best management structure for veterans will probably do best with them going forward.
We have a list actually up on our site today of sort of the rise of the new veterans, and I think that, you know, the people we're talking about for president now, the Marco Rubios, the Ted Cruz, I mean, like, they're sort of in that gap of where we had a peacetime, and you're not talking about a lot of members of that sort of time period with military service, but I think that in, you know, a cycle or two, you're going to be talking about some of these people as legitimate presidential candidates, as legitimate Senate, as even more Senate candidates. I mean, one of our top one to watch is actually Tammy Duckworth in Illinois. I mean, whether she runs for Senate in Illinois is going to be that's going to be a fascinating race if Mark Kirk does run again. And you know, I mean, I think that it won't be that long before we see, I think, an Iraq or an Afghanistan veteran out there in the field, and even possible president. I mean, you know, you sort of we will not have had a Vietnam veteran there in the presidency, but you know, we'll see what happens in the coming years. But yeah, as John said, we're creating more and more veterans every day.
I would say that we did come awfully close to the politicization of VA management and competence this past year, and I was glad that it was relatively short-lived.
We have another question from the audience.
Winstina Hughes, JSA alum. I have a really simple question. When President Obama uses executive order for immigration, what's the likelihood of a Democrat being elected during the next election?
In 2016?
Yeah,
Yeah,
the next presidential election.
Yeah, so I think you know, we're talking about, you know, today's Veterans Day, and in battle you always, say, don't fight the last war, fight the next war. So one of the lessons of 2014 is not, you know, what could we have done better in Arkansas, and let's apply for 2016. As we've been talking about all day, we have different electorates, and in 2016, things like immigration reform and this executive action play well in a lot of these key states, in Nevada and Colorado, and to a certain extent New Mexico, and maybe in Virginia. So, I actually think whereas, you know, in September we had a delay on executive action, and a big part of that was because it didn't play well in some of these red states. Going into 2016 is actually going to be an asset to Democrats to lean into that issue. So I think it's actually helpful.
Is this a signal, though, that Obama is going to try to go around Congress to the extent that he can? And on that same note, and David, maybe you can answer this because you used to work on government reform, can we expect to see a lot of investigations of the administration coming down the pike?
The answer is absolutely yes. I mean, you have to go back and talk to your constituents about something, and in the absence of any robust legislative activity, oversight and investigations often fill the vacuum. The question is, you know, to what degree will we see renewed sort of collaboration between the House and Senate committees now that both are in Republican hands, and to what degree will there be any, at least in the near term, some joint investigations and inquiries with Republicans and Democrats? We've heard some good sounds, but my sense is heading into 2016 that before too long, the pressure from above and outside on the Republican chairman will be too much to overcome.
Any other questions?
Good morning. There's been a lot of talk about the 2016 presidential elections, but I'm curious what you see for the future of the Senate and whether the Republican majority will be short-lived or they'll be able to hold their majority in 2016. What are some of the races to watch?
The map flips
Literally.
dramatically. And whereas Democrats had a lot of seats up and had the math working against them, the shoe's on the other foot in 2016 for the Senate for Republicans in a big way, and they know that. And one of the things about how the president conducts himself with executive orders, et cetera, don't forget that that was part of the right's battle cry of 2014, that the president was overreaching his authority and provoking not just Congress, but provoking voters who he has an obligation to work through the constitutional system. And a lot of people thought that he was beyond the pale with some of this stuff. So how he behaves in the next 2 years will create for Hillary Clinton a whole series of questions. She's already got to figure out how she's going to react to the executive order on immigration policy, when it goes bad, when it goes well, when it goes, sort of medium. And because she's going to get grilled on it, as will every other Democrat on the ballot in 2016, as they get into their primary processes. Remember, the Democrats got to pick their nominees when there will be actions by this lame duck president that will divide Democrats too. So how he chooses to act has to be conscious of those red states and states that were blue until a week ago and are now purple, or even heading towards purple or red in a presidential cycle when the colors actually do turn. But those types of bank shots have to be calculated now because there's just, again, 9 months to do all this work and they got to get back out there and run.
Which is, I think, one of the reasons you're going to see Secretary Clinton wait as long as she can before getting into a race, because the minute she's actually a candidate, she has to start answering these questions about, do you agree with the president's executive order on immigration? Of course, the answer has to be, I agree that we need to legalize folks. And at the same time, she's got to signal that she doesn't believe in an expansive view of the presidency to the extent that President Obama did or President Bush did. I mean, Obama ran on how he wasn't going to do signing statements and how he was going to, rein in executive power, and we've seen just the opposite.
And the other thing is the Senate is going to go through a smaller version of what happened to the House in 2010, when Republicans and the Tea Party, sort of eliminated the vast majority of blue dog centrist Democrats. They replaced them with Tea Party guys who a lot of them wouldn't work with John Boehner. So now a handful of these Senate Democrats that Republicans could occasionally count on for a vote here or there, or at least for to go to cloture, they're now gone and replaced by some conservative guys who might not want to play ball in all these circumstances. So the elimination of centrist Democrats when a Republican wave happens, just as the elimination of Republicans centrists happen when there's a Democratic wave, makes it real hard for the compromise that everybody hopes for, because there's fewer of them around on the opposite side who are inclined to listen to the other.
Yeah, and I think what you'll see Democrats do, and you can already see Obama trying to set this up and say, listen, here's what I did with this executive action. Now it's up to Republicans. If you guys don't like it, so much, and you think, I'm acting like a dictator, then you have ample opportunity to actually change this and do your own version of immigration reform. So I think you'll hear that from Democrats. I think you'll hear that from Hillary Clinton. And in the meantime, they also hope that these Republicans will say something off color about immigrants, about Latinos, and it'll further damage the party's standing with Latinos.
We have another question from the audience.
Hi, Andy Green, JSA alum. Elizabeth Warren is one of the most popular surrogates out on the trail in 2014, at least that's the sense from afar. And folks who ran on sort of more economic populist platforms did fairly well, whether it's in Oregon or even you could argue in New Hampshire. And in minimum wage, states that had minimum wage initiatives on the ballot, Nebraska, I think Arkansas had one. I mean, they did very well. What's your sense of where, and frankly, not too long ago, the Democratic governor primary, you had a very strong economic populist sort of insurgent campaign, get a lot of traction. What's your sense of where that energy goes over the next 2-3 years? How does it get translated into useful energy on the Hill, either on the Democrat or Republican side, and then what do you think it does to either both the Democratic Party internally into 2016 or elsewhere?
I don't think we're going to see as much of a divide within the Democratic Party as we've seen on the Republican side, but it is one to watch, certainly. I mean, you have the Ready for Warren people, too. They're certainly not as influential, nor will be, as the Ready for Clinton people, but there is sort of this economic populist wing of the Democratic Party that I don't think may not ever be satisfied with Hillary, especially if she runs more to the center. And it was very striking on election night that you did see some of these policies win in a state like Arkansas while the Democrat was being blown out on that side. So I think it shows that, maybe they want to see it more incrementally on a state by state level, but Elizabeth Warren, I think it's where she channels her energy and where sort of the progressive wing of the party comes out, whether it's focusing more of their energy toward the Senate, if it is finally getting behind Hillary. But I think you see some very deep dissatisfaction with it. They don't think that you have to move toward the center. And in fact, you saw a lot of people coming out the next day blaming the losses for, well, it's because they abandoned the base. They weren't running and they weren't sort of speaking this language. They thought that it was relying too much on blue dogs and stuff too. So if there is a Hillary coming out there speaking more to the center, I think you'll certainly see a challenger from the left. I think it's just a question of who it is.
Elizabeth Warren says what Democrats are thinking when they're getting into their Mercedes and driving to their job at Goldman Sachs. So, I think that, it's popular with Democrats to speak in such a populist way. But if you look at Hillary Clinton in primary polling, self-described liberals like her better than self-described moderates and self-described conservatives in the Democratic Party. I think the energy for that kind of populism is on the Hill. I think that it's in the details of legislation. I think it's that if you had a working Congress, it would be in pushing things in that direction. I think you saw a fair amount of that with Dodd-Frank in the Obama's first couple of years, where there was a push and then there was a push back. But for instance, the Blanche Lincoln stuff on derivatives that basically expanded the CFTC, that's something that came from that sort of populist part of the Democratic Party. So I think that's where you see it. I think at the presidential level, it's more of a muddle.
Yeah, I think on the Republican side, you'll see folks like Rand Paul, Paul Ryan, if he runs, or even if he stays in Congress, they very much want to talk more about poverty, right? They don't necessarily want to talk about income inequality because maybe that sounds too much like class warfare, but they are talking about poverty much more. And in some ways, it fits in with sort of the evangelical base and, help out your brother or whatever. So there's that. In terms of Elizabeth Warren, I think one of the things that when you sort of look at Elizabeth Warren, sort of people compare her, could she be, the Obama of this cycle? But I think one of the things about Obama, what made him so effective in countering Hillary Clinton was in part that he was more liberal on some issues, but he also was able to get new voters out, African-American voters, Latino voters, younger voters, and it's not clear to me yet that Elizabeth Warren is that figure, that she is anything more than sort of a boutique liberal at this point. I don't know if she would have a very strong pull with those kind of grassroots Obama coalition folks.
You should coin that.
What's
Boutique liberal.
I like it.
That's fantastic. You should write that column.
So we're about out of time, but before we let our panelists go, I want to ask each of you to tell me the two members that you're going to watch in the new Congress and why.
I guess I'll start. Cory Gardner is one. I think if he ends up being the type of senator that he campaigned as, I think he could be a constructive force in Congress. And the other one, just applied to a friend, we're talking about veterans, is Ruben Gallego from Phoenix, 34-year-old guy. He was in leadership in Arizona in the State House. So I think he can do some things over the long haul in the House side.
I'm going to be a homer and go to my home state of Virginia. I'm interested to see Senator Mark Warner's reaction to his scare, whether he becomes an occasional partner of Republican majority in the Senate, and how he positions himself back home in a new, fresh way. And also newly elected Congresswoman Barbara Comstock, a former staffer on the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. She now has her third or fourth real job. And I think she's going to be an interesting one to watch.
I was going to say Comstock, so I got to think of another one quickly. I think, frankly, the emphasis on freshmen is misplaced. I think the guy to watch is Mitch McConnell. Having said that, man, I wish I could have gotten Comstock. I should have said
It's okay, you can have one.
I'll come up with something.
But on McConnell, I mean, this is going to be an interesting time for him.
I think that what all of these, I think it is just, there we go. I think that McConnell clearly has made his career goal of becoming the majority leader. He's done it with a remarkable path. Even his harshest critics on the left concede that it was a pretty incredible thing that was accomplished, and he's now coming in with great strength in the end of the Obama term. If they overplay it, if Mitch McConnell can't keep the troops in line and move things through and do a reasonable and serviceable job, the Republican control of the Congress could become a liability in 2016 for the Republican nominee. And how he manages that, I think, is far more important than whether Barbara Comstock or Tom Cotton or any other freshman senator behave well in the next couple of years as they're training. By the way, this is their orientation week, so the new people, and there aren't very many, it's another 94% re-election rate here. They're learning the jobs as they move from one side of the Capitol to the other is what's happening.
Nia?
I'm going to go with Tim Scott, who's my guy from South Carolina, which is where I'm from, and Mia Love. These are two of the three black Republicans who are in the Senate of this go-round. Of course, Tim Scott got reelected, was already in the Senate. But I'm really interested in the Republican Party's efforts to rebrand themselves among African Americans. And part of that is rebranding what black Republicans look like, because for the last many years, it's been sort of Allen West kind of figures. And not like Condi Rice. And so I'm really interested to see how Tim Scott and Mia Love engage with that debate. They don't have any real sort of substantive power necessarily because they're so junior, but in terms of symbols and in terms of this great debate we're having about race and Republicans and Democrats, I think they're going to be fascinating to watch.
I can't beat that. That was pretty good. I agree. I think Tim Scott in particular, he's such a fascinating political figure because he's so good.
Yeah.
He's such a good quality member of Congress, very thoughtful guy. I think he's kind of a future, I would have him doing outreach. If I were the Republican Party, I would have him doing outreach to African Americans in every state in the country. My answers would be Rand Paul, because he's sitting in the Senate. I think he has a path to the Republican nomination. Doesn't mean he's going to get it, but I think it is a viable, viewable path. But he's the person that's going to have to vote, as opposed to all these other gubernatorial guys. I don't think Ted Cruz is likely to end up the Republican nominee. Certainly Democrats will ask for his long-form birth certificate before that happens. But Rand Paul is going to have to position himself while dealing with all these issues coming in, and that's always a complication for senators. So I think that's interesting. I'm also interested to see Gwen Graham, the freshman Democrat from Tallahassee, Bob Graham's daughter. Just an interesting political lineage there, and a night where everybody said that all the white Southern Democrats were gone. That was a white Southern Democrat that won. Tallahassee, not exactly like the middle of Georgia. It's a little different, but I still think that it'll be interesting to watch how she navigates and whether she becomes the leader of a more moderate Democratic faction in the House.
John took one of mine with Gwen Graham. I'll also add it would be interesting to see if she runs statewide too. I think they're sort of grooming her as a statewide candidate down the line, especially if that's a hard seat for them to hold. But I'll say Joni Ernst, just about her background in Veterans Affairs, she said she wants to work for sexual harassment oversight in the military to maybe get a coalition on that. She certainly had to campaign in the primary as more of a conservative, but you saw a dramatic transformation in the general election. She was branding herself as a soldier, a mom, and then an independent. The word conservative was gone. So how does she sort of work within the Senate? Does she become more of an independent? Is she looking to position herself for 6 years before her reelection? And then I'll say Harry Reid. How does he govern from the minority? And he also is up in 2016. Does he run for reelection? How does he sort of position that in a state that is moving, more conservative? Even we saw, Stephen Horsford lose there in Nevada. What does this mean for his reelection prospects? How does he sort of go into his own 2016, and how does he manage Democratic caucus against Mitch McConnell too?
Well, Jessica Taylor, Jonathan Allen, Nia-Malika Henderson, Carl Cameron, David Marin, and Oscar Ramirez, I want to thank you guys for joining us. It was a really interesting discussion. I hope that our guests benefited from it. I want to thank the Junior Statesmen of America for joining us today, and of course the Podesta Group thanks you all for being here. So thanks very much.